My girl and I go out and join the park parade. Arm in arm we stroll along a happy.
Okay, so we're here with our third episode of the Battlefront podcast called Collecting War. Today I'm here with Mr. Simon Cusens. Thank you for accepting our invite. So it will definitely be another interesting podcast because we'll be talking with a collector, once again, that collects a lot of different types of militaria. Not only militaria, not only things from the Second World War, but I think mostly. I think I'm going to start this episode by asking Mr. Cusens what exactly he collects and where it all started from.
I collect military vehicles, militaria in general, however, with a particular, shall we say, focus on the Malta story, the Malta World War II campaign. I collect Maltese books, rare books. I collect Maltese periodicals and ephemera, things like Royal Opera posters, newspapers, documents like personal documents, personal artifacts, driving licenses, I would say mostly relating to the 20th century. Essentially, those items.
So you consider yourself a collector, of course, right? So when do you think Mr. Cusens became a collector?
The first memory I have of collections was when I was aged about 12, where I asked my father to take me to the Pembroke Ranges so I could collect bullet casings from where our armed forces used to practice. But I would like to give you a context, because by that time I already had a strong interest in old vehicles, not necessarily military by that point. But I was born in 1968, which is only 23 years after the end of World War II. So I clearly remember derelict buildings still showing bomb damage in Valletta, other parts of Malta. They were still fairly common in the early 70s. My grandfather was British. I knew he was a soldier in the war, so to some extent there was some, shall I say, curiosity about his past. As a child, I grew up to the age of 7 in Vgura with a field just across the house where we used to play like the generation before us as soldiers, and we used to build camps, we used to call them, from broken stones. So I learned only many years later that this is how wartime children played, because this is what they remembered. So at that point, this must have been my father's generation, who somehow through their influence, this sort of passed on as a pastime, playing, soldiers in the field, climbing, doing dangerous things, climbing trees, jumping into buildings under construction. And also in Vgura, across the road, there was a massive scrapyard full of scrap vehicles, which, being vehicles scrapped in the early 70s, were predominantly vehicles from the 1930s and 40s. So I have vivid memories of my father taking me to the scrap heap just across the road in Vgura to play on derelict cars. And my father tells me that from the age of 3, even before I can remember, I preferred playing in derelict cars than on the swings, for example. So I think these 3 aspects molded what later became a hobby. An interest in old cars, an interest in World War II, and games which I believe were reminiscent of post-war Malta.
It seems that when your first memory concerning collecting is, of course, your father's trips with your father to the scrap heap, but you mentioned that your first memory of collecting is strictly military debris. No, you mentioned
Yes. Ever since I began to use public transport and started venturing out of the house on my own, my first place to visit was the Sunday Monte, the Sunday market in Valletta. And I was already in the Boy Scouts at that age, which was to some extent a paramilitary experience. We used to do hikes, camping, we used to sleep under canvas, we used to wear military clothing. I was exposed to military tents and military items like, cooking devices, ropes, knotting skills. So to some extent, I was intrigued with acquiring my own items made of canvas, which I could use in the Scouts, and which were very widespread and very cheap. I could buy them with pocket money in those days.
You mentioned, for example, that canvas. Okay, so what is it about military antiques you think attracted you so much as a child? Was it the materials, they were different, or was it because of the past that Malta had just undergone?
To some extent, I think the cars in the scrapyard must have made a lasting impression. Their shape, their models were clearly the war era vehicles. My favorite, I remember, was situated in an alley which is there no longer in the main street of Gura on Hompesh Road, in front of a bar which used to be called Keyhole Bar. It may still be there. And opposite it, there was this alley, and there was an Austin utility parked outside the owner's house, a derelict farmer's Austin utility, which, as you know, is one of the most widely used military vehicles, which after the war became associated with rural Malta and farmers, because many military vehicles went this way after the war. And I remember that was my favorite vehicle. I know my father got permission from the owner, who would be sitting on the doorstep as I played in it. And I remember one day putting my shoulder all the way through the glove compartment, my whole arm, right up to my shoulder. It had a very deep glove compartment, and pulling out this shepherd figure from the Christmas crib, which I located deep inside
which you're holding right now.
The drawer's recess, which I still possess today, more than 50 years after I found it. And I remember many years later, when my father was setting the Christmas crib, sometime in my teenage years, he had an identical shepherd from a set which he had purchased. And it struck me that in the house, we now had two identical shepherds. And I remember years later, in my late teens, I mentioned to my dad, when he was setting up the Christmas crib, I pointed to the shepherd, and I told him, "Dad, you remember the Austin Tilly used to take me to play in Vgura?" And yes, he said, "It was your favorite wreck." I said, "That shepherd you have, I found an identical one in the Tilly, which I kept." And he told me, "Here, take it." So I now have two of them. I don't know which one was in the Tilly, because they're identical.
Then you still have them. They're in front of us as we
Yes,
speak.
but I think this really ties me back to the vehicle which left a marked impression, which years later, at the age of 19, I would go on to purchase.
It seems that your childhood has had a very important impact on your collecting to this day, right? So would you say that obviously you just said it's the spark. Was it the same spark that propelled you to collect in your teenagers, in your 20s, 30s?
Well, I used to spend a lot of time with my grandfather in summer. He was a fisherman, although he was a soldier here. After getting off the beach in Dunkirk, he was posted to Malta. and he never went back. He stayed here, he met my grandma here, he learned Maltese. He's British, that's why my surname is Cusens. And it intrigued me that he was a soldier, because I used to like playing as soldiers with my next door neighbor, a chap called Albert Bell, who's a heavy metal musician today and a lecturer at university at the same time, if you can believe that. So with my childhood memories take me to playing with Albert, my next door neighbor, and my grandfather being a soldier, it intrigued me a lot. So I remember at school, in my spare time, doodling military figures, the British flag, the Maltese flag, the figure of a soldier. So I looked at my grandfather, who spoke very little. He was a very stern man of few words, and it was only very late in my upper 30s, if not 40s, that I really began to have conversation, meaningful conversation with my grandfather, by which time I was already a collector. So I think the combination of my passion in old cars, and I don't mean military cars. I remember looking out of the window as my father drove by, aged 6, 7, particularly struck by the old cars on Maltese roads. Now, the old cars on Maltese roads in the early 70s were cars from the 30s and 40s. And they intrigued me. There was something that attracted me to them. And then our games, and then the Boy Scouts, and my grandfather. So in a way, I think those molded a mindset that led me into the military aspect, which was my first collection. It started with webbing and clothing, which I could wear at Scouts. And then it turned into gun casings and this type of militaria. From there, I then ventured into military vehicles, which I remember my first purchase was a Willys Jeep, even before I could even legally drive, when I was 16. So I ended up buying 22 vehicles by the age of, I think, 25. Mostly civilian, but then I decided to sell all the civilian vehicles and keep the 4 or 5 military vehicles that I still have today, 2 motorcycles, 2 light cars, and a truck. And as I grew older, I began to read about Malta at War, and by reading, I started collecting books. And as I learned more about Malta at War, I expanded the topic, because you can't just study the warriors, you have to learn the context of society. And again, I began to get intrigued with daily life in Malta, so I began buying periodicals, newspapers. I have a very large newspaper collection. And I then discovered highly collectible books by Michelanton Vassalli, Onorato Bres, and a number of famous authors, not quite because they were prolific writers, but because there are some milestone books about Maltese history, and we're now going well beyond World War II, or rather before World War II. So I ventured into militancia, as against to Maltese militaria.
Do you think that collecting precedes your interest, or your interest precedes what you collect? Do you find an interesting topic and then you collect items, or does the collection guide you towards what you're interested in? What do you think comes first?
Clearly, the collection came first as a child. The vehicles became a progression of militaria because I was able to drive a car and I was fascinated with the idea of being able to own a working military vehicle. I then got into a circle of military vehicle owners who taught me a lot about the hobby. From that aspect of military vehicles, I ventured into wartime Malta as a society, which is where I took an interest in the books. And reading the books I remember in 2001, I once was having a chat with my son, wondering whether anybody was still alive from the siege of Malta, which set me off on a wild goose chase, writing to newspapers all over the world. In those days, the internet was in its infancy, leaving my address and phone, asking people who were here in the siege to get in touch. And that led to a friendship with about 350 Siege of Malta veterans from the Navy, Army, Air Force, Merchant Navy, civil society, who I befriended. And I learned so much in chatting with them. I enjoyed them for about 15, in some cases 20 years, before they all passed away, of course. So speaking to those people, first of all, they gave me a lot of stuff which they had saved and kept as souvenirs from the war. So I think by that point, I started dabbling in militancia, in Maltese relics, either militaria related or civil society related. So definitely the precursor was the collection.
I think this is an important point you just mentioned, that a part of your collection was actually given to you by people who were veterans or were there during the war.
Yes, by that time, though, I was a prolific collector already. Mm-hmm. But a lot of the relics you see in this library, in this museum here, some of them were donated, and some of them are very unique and special because there is a story which is attached. Mm-hmm. Some of these stories are now part of Maltese folklore, our wartime folklore stories. And I read a lot around these incidents. So you would need to acquire a number of books that support that particular event. And it's very tempting when you come across other artifacts related to these focus areas that you end up buying them as well.
So in a way, these people and the artifacts themselves maybe entrust you with keeping the memory of the objects, right?
Absolutely.
Do you feel that responsibility, that you're now responsible for those memories?
Like hell I do. You've actually hit the nail on the head. All these war veterans who became very dear friends, if I had to ask what was the very one question they would ask of me after all the time we spent together talking, I would say the most common question that they had for me or request was that I keep their story alive, that I make sure that nobody forgets what they went through. So this was a promise I made to them, many of them. That's all they cared about. That's why they entrusted me with items that they took care of for 60 years, 70 years. And some of them actually would not part with the item until their death. And then I was contacted by the family who told me that it was their wish that those items be donated to me after their death. Mm-hmm. So I now have a moral obligation. Now I feel obliged. It's my duty. 5 years ago, I went into semi-retirement, and most of my time today is either lecturing, talking about, I do TV programs, I work with producers, I've done documentaries, I've done script correcting. It's all about being associated with projects, movies, productions, books, theatrical productions that have to do with Malta at war, in a view to educate the younger generation and to keep the story alive.
Yes, I think that's a very important point, because maybe a lot of collectors might not have a direct relationship with the people, with their objects. You obviously, I think you can look around your collection and say, "This, I know where this came from. I know the person who actually had this during the war, or used it, or acquired it." So you have a very personal connection with your objects, right? Do you feel like, for example, if someone gave you something, especially after their death, but they signed off that you will have it after their death, do you feel like you own the object or it's being lent to you, sort of? Do you feel possession of it or do you feel like you're taking care of it for someone else?
I feel very much as a custodian more than an owner, because some of these items are so special that I already have a plan for them after, my time is up. So I am already in discussion with the National Archives of Rabat. I actually have a very large donation that I'm dealing right now, where, for example, they will get 200 hours of recordings that have never been heard, which are on VHS tapes, which nobody has a VHS recorder anymore today. So they are going to spend several thousands to get these 200 hours converted to digital. They will have a digital copy as I will as well. I retain the copyright, but they are free to use it for research and education, and thereby this gold mine of interviews and recordings made in this particular occasion relating to the Santa Maria convoy will at least see the light of day in the National Collection and allow even myself to be able to listen to them for the first time. They were collected in the 1980s and they were passed on to me by somebody who felt that I might be the right caretaker after they pass away. So I traveled to England with 2 empty suitcases and I personally brought these tapes to Malta, and now after 20 years in my possession, hopefully sometime next year I will be able to listen for the first time to these incredible recordings done with protagonists from the convoy, captains, officers, people who were in the middle of the action in this famous August 42 convoy. So I will be working with our national collection to make sure that some of these artifacts and many others after my passing, that they will end up in the national collection because they are very unique and very special pieces which are now testimony to wartime Malta.
To people like us, I think, Simon, it would be obvious that this is something that needs to happen, especially in terms of opening them up to the public so they can better appreciate the past, especially the Second World War. But some people might tell you, why do we need to remember war? Why is it important? It's like a trauma we need to forget, sort of. Or so what would you say to those people?
Well, for all those people who thought that the World War II story and the Malta story ought to be consigned to the archives of history, I will just say, think of what happened on February 24th, 2022 this year with the invasion of Ukraine. Case in point, all of a sudden, 80 years after the end of what we thought would be a calamity that would never be repeated, we again see the ugly head of fascism. This time fascism isn't black, it's red. We have a country like Ukraine, an enormous country, tens of millions of people, that has been invaded with, political agendas. And we have, once again, millions of civilians suffering the horrors that we endured 80 years ago. My comment is this: we must not forget, because we live in hope to never repeat. And the war in Ukraine is precisely why we must not forget and take freedom for granted. This would be the biggest mistake, that we think that the situations that led to World War II would not be repeated. And I can't think of a better example than the events of February 24th, 2022. And I see another symbol on the Maltese flag. We have the George Cross, which is predominantly an effigy. It is not a medal. The medal is in the museum where many people agree it should be. It is a symbol of a nationwide struggle of a duration under siege that lasted 3 years, but of a struggle that lingered on well into the 1950s and 60s, still breaking up families with emigration because of the post-war depravities and economic doldrums that Malta ended up in. So the pain of World War II carried on, I would say, till the early 1970s. Okay? Apart from the casualties, the deaths, the injuries, the maimed, the psychologically damaged, the permanently damaged people, it broke up a lot of families. Okay? It destroyed Maltese social fabric. It destroyed, for example, the industry of Maltese lace that was broken up due to programs of emigration for young women and entire families after the war. We look at the Maltese accents in the villages. All the internal refugees we had of wartime Malta, they damaged, if you like, this element of Maltese society, where today we have a hodgepodge and when you can no longer really recognize people from their town or village, very rarely. So this was a calamity, something that left so much damage in its wake. And again, we must teach the younger generation of the price paid by our ancestors, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, and we must not take their sacrifice for granted. All the conveniences, the privileges, the perks, the comforts we have of today came because those who came before us resisted the dark forces of tyranny, of oppression, of Nazism, of fascism. And unlike what happened in Ukraine, we succeeded. All Europe succumbed to Nazism and fascism, including North Africa, and Malta alone, 1,000 kilometers from Gibraltar or Alexandria, otherwise surrounded by hostility everywhere. Those were the two exceptions where we had friends, 1,000 kilometers to the west and 1,000 to the east in Gibraltar and Alexandria. Somehow we managed not to fall and succumb to these dark forces. So we came out relatively lightly when you look at the casualties, less than 1,600 who died instantly. Of course, we had many casualties who died later, not to mention the suicides. Considering all, we came out relatively unscathed. I can't say that for the construction above land, okay, because it was mostly destroyed. But thanks to our limestone and burrowing like rats, we lived and managed to be spared much more casualties. We lived like rats underground for 3 years. And if there is one thing, the vets I met, almost 400 veterans I could count amongst my friends, they didn't want anybody to forget. And they posed this question to me and they told me, please tell our story. Please don't let the story be forgotten.
I think that obviously the Second World War, and especially the Second World War in Malta, is a very important part of our history, especially for you. You feel it's almost like you're saying this is something that we need to be proud of. It's something that we need to never forget, right? And some collectors might share that idea with you. They will collect things, different things they find in markets, etc., etc. Do you feel that there are some collectors that perhaps buy things, but they don't appreciate the value of what they have, or they just accumulate things? What's the difference between a collector who is there to safeguard the memory of the objects and a collector who just collects objects?
You find both types of collectors. I know, I'm thinking of one collector right now who likes to collect the same item. So he will have
Literally the same item.
he will have multiples of the same item. So he will find a rare car part, say a carburetor of a particular rare military vehicle, and he will be happy to tell you he has 9 or 10 of that part, and he won't sell that part to somebody who needs it to restore his vehicle. So for him, the collection it's almost like a kleptomaniac or a hoarder. It's not really about the story behind the item. It's purely about needing to have as many of that item. And he will have multiples of other items as well. And he may have a common theme, for example, World War II, okay, or military vehicles, which can span before the war and after the war. Then you have other collectors who are more conscious of the story. So they will have an artifact which they then research, because there are markings or a name, so they will locate records of the previous owner or user of the object, and they'll build a story around the object, which will give that item much more value monetarily. But I would say, because there is no real monetary figure that you can place to these items, the items that come with a story become almost sacred items. When I look at some of my pieces and I know the context, they are not collectibles. They are almost sacred objects to me, and because of what they represent and the people who have since passed on, they become very, very precious on the sentimental level. And when you have the story to them, it's another dimension. It's not just a collectible.
This sacrality of things you mentioned is a very common theme across even the last podcast we did with Mr. Petroni, who mentioned that when he holds an item, he feels like it's almost he shouldn't be holding it, because it's directly connected, or it represents the absence of the person. It has a sort of aura to it.
Absolutely. I can't agree more. I remember when I was privileged to be engaged by government to bring to Malta the original bell of SS Ohio, the tanker that saved Malta in 1942. I brought it over for the 60th anniversary reunion for survivors. I tracked down 250 survivors, and 105 of them turned up in 2010 for a week, an unforgettable week, to mark the 60th anniversary of the mission. I remember SS Ohio's bell, which you can see in that photograph there.
Yeah, Simon is pointing at a photograph of him with the bell from SS
That's
Ohio,
20
right?
years ago. You can see the marking on the bell, SS Ohio, 1942. I can tell you from memory, it is today where it was then, hanging on board HQS Wellington, which is a permanently berthed ship at Victoria Embankment, Temple Stairs in London, which is where Captain Mason of Ohio donated it to. He was a member of the Honourable Company of Master Mariners who meet on board this ship. It's a very old club for retired captains. I had the privilege to be engaged by government to bring it to Malta. I had it in my home for a month, and I didn't have the guts to swing the clapper and sound it. And we only did that at St. James Cavalier on the Friday in September. I remember the date, 27 September 2002. We got 2 original crew from Ohio, Alan Shaw and Ray Morton, to take the rope on the clapper together and swing it once. We rang the bell just once to open the official events of the week-long reunion. So we used 2 authentic crew members from the ship to swing the clapper. I did not have the guts to do it myself. It was like the soul of the convoy. So in the box it went again, and it stayed in the box. I lingered a bit. I was in awe and in amazement at having this in my home. And eventually I had to return it. That was the promise. So I took it to London by hand. I loaded it in a London cab. I remember it weighed 50 kilos in the box, and I returned it back to the ship. So I felt like I was carrying something like the Ark of the Covenant. If you watched Indiana Jones, you get my drift, Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Yes.
That is what some items are. They are not pieces, they are not relics. They are very much the soul of that event. At least that's
Relics,
my
right?
interpretation.
Like a saint's relic, you find a piece of a bone of a saint or something, maybe.
Not the best comparison for
Why
me,
not?
because I consider it far holier than that.
Really?
On the context of religion, we know in medieval times there were peddlers, religious peddlers who peddled animal bones as saintly relics. So today it's very hard to really know which the real relics are. I mean, there are hands purported to be of a particular saint, where you may have 4 or 5 hands in different parts of Catholic Europe, when obviously there could only have been 2. So
But there's fakes in militaria as well. And then
yes, that's true. That's very true. However, when you know you're handling the real thing, there is this aura, that's the correct word that you used. I mean, now I'm pointing there to a Royal Navy officer's cap, for example, sitting atop a dispatch rider helmet. That is the original cap of Captain Roger Hill, the captain of HMS Ledbury that nudged Ohio from the rear to steer it because its rudder was jammed to port. When I convinced his family to bring his ashes for scattering in Malta, we scattered them on that very day that we swung the clapper, 27 September 2002. We scattered his ashes 2 kilometers off Zonor Point, and his son bequeathed the cap and his father's uniform to the Cusens collection. So people look at a cap and I can picture Roger Hill. I've seen him on video, I've seen him interviewed, and I see this aura of this big burly man who was instrumental in bringing Ohio in with the other 2 captains of HMS Bremen and HMS Penn.
do you think that, obviously you've met people from the Ohio convoy and you did a lot of work to safeguard their memories. This idea that the items they possessed are literally sacred, I mean, to us it's very easy to, even as you're mentioning it, I can almost get shivers down my spine looking at it, because I know the story behind that cap and I can picture the person that wore it. I can feel connected to that event through the object. But is it the same for people who actually wore it? I mean, for them at one point it was, maybe did it mean more than that for them, or did it mean less?
I can show you an artifact behind you. I know that your audience cannot
But
see
we can
it,
describe it.
but I can describe it. And this is a very grubby, damaged dictionary of English and Italian, which during the war was held against someone's chest, a kid who was off to his private lesson, just in the way I'm demonstrating now. The book is over 700 pages thick. And all of a sudden, a piece of shrapnel during an air attack came straight at the kid who was on his way to the lesson, hitting the book. As you can see, the damage, which perforates right through the book, all the way. Okay, you can see many pages here. And basically was stopped only by the thickness of the book. The shrapnel entered and exited and saved the kid's life. So you can imagine, for the owner of this dictionary, right until this man lived his final years as an elderly man, this book had pride of place. In his life, in his home, it was a very special item. Why? Because it saved his life. And if you see this on the pavement outside, you wouldn't even bend over to pick it. It's falling to pieces, as you can see. But the man's grandson, knowing that I was a big collector and not having the slightest inclination or passion like me on World War II memorabilia, he still felt an obligation to find a safe haven for this book. And this is how many of the items reach me. People feel that although they're not connected with the hobby, they feel the item is special, even if they don't appreciate it enough. And they look for people like myself, and they feel satisfied, they feel serene that they found a good home, they found somebody who will nurture, care, and look after the item, just like the relative, perhaps, and owner, the previous owner. So I seem to have gained this type of reputation. I'm not just a collector. I'm a great fan of the wartime generation. So today I sold my business, I retired very young, and today in a way, I'm associated full-time with keeping the World War II story alive in everything I do. And it's not just the collection. I have Facebook pages which I administer. I encourage people to share stories, because I have this duty that I explained at the beginning of the interview to make sure the story is not forgotten.
Can you comment on that idea? Because it happens a lot that maybe someone dies and their children might appreciate the item but not enough to keep it. Why do you think that happens?
Well, one of the main problems is when you have multiple children and you only have one item, the kids themselves cannot amicably agree on who is going to keep it.
And this happens?
This happened. And they agreed to donate because they can't decide. They all want it and they all know they can't have it. So the family will meet me and they will donate it to me. And I want to show you one of these items, a very, very special item. Again, I open my cabinet here and I will let you figure out what this is. Look closely. Very, very special, insignificant looking stamp, a rubber stamp.
From the Ohio? Rubber stamp from the Ohio?
SS Ohio with the serial number of the ship. If you Google that serial number and the name of the ship, you will find that is actually the American Merchant Marine original serial number of the tanker originally commissioned by Texaco, just like its sister ship Kentucky, and both ships were sunk. Kentucky was sunk on a Malta convoy and Ohio managed to arrive but did not live to see another day, and she was eventually scuttled after the war. So here we have the original ship stamp, which was taken by Alan Shaw. The ship was a gunner, so people were just taking stuff before they left the ship. And together with a flag of the Royal Fleet Auxiliary, which was in the locker of Ohio, and a Bible and a letter connected with Ohio, the Bible was on board, which came from another crewman. These artifacts were given to me by these people who had cherished them all their life. And this stamp was actually given to me by the crew member of Ohio before he died, but after he died, I was given the flag, which was too special to him. He used to fly it in his garden. Although it never flew on the ship, it was taken from the locker. And after his death, his children told me that it was his wish for me to have the flag. And when they came to scatter his ashes, I'm now pointing to a pencil drawing by one of his children. That's the man there, Alan Shaw. If you look in the corner of that cabinet, you'll see that cylinder that burgundy-colored cylinder, in there are his ashes. Because Alan and I were such good friends that after the scattering, with still a fair amount of ashes in the cylinder, the family said, we'd like you to have him, take him home, keep him, because we know you were really good friends. I even had a special tile at Bay Street, if you remember the Hall of Fame, which is there no longer. Alan had his imprint made in the Hall of Fame. And when I got word that they were going to remove all those tiles because they had to redo the floor, I managed to get Bay Street to salvage the tile, to remove it without breaking it, and it is now here in my museum further back. So as you can see, I've built relics, not necessarily wartime now, around the life of a man who was on the ship that saved Malta. And these are the type of artifacts that will never end up on the market. These are the type of artifacts that I feel should one day go to the national collection.
I'm going to ask you a tough question now. Some people might argue that people like us, I mean, we're both collectors. Your collector, obviously, collection is much more mature than mine, of course. We collect different things, but we collect the Second World War. We're both interested in it. We're both appreciative of it. Some people might say that if we had a war today, we wouldn't think of the Second World War the same way. It would be, we can appreciate the Second World War because we didn't live through it, because it's not a trauma for us personally, right? Would you agree? Would you disagree with that?
I think World War II was the last moral war, the last morally correct war. All the wars that followed, in my opinion, were political. They were biased and they were motivated by greed. So I disagree with your comment, because the next war we will have in our world will not be a morally correct war. It will be yet again another war like the invasion of Ukraine, like Vietnam, like other wars, Iran, Iraq, where the motivation was oil, greed, power, geographical designation, politics. But in World War II, humanity was at stake, globally. So we cannot really relate to any new war to World War II. In World War II, we basically had a tyrant supported by other megalomaniacs like him on a course of world domination, where ideology divided the world into the privileged and the expendables. So when the Allies decided to go to war, it was essentially in defense of human values, of mankind, of peace-loving nations. You know, we hear the notion that Malta was attacked because it was a colony. Tell that to the Norwegians. Tell that to the Dutch. There was no, no British imperialism there. Tell that to the Belgians. Okay, and many other countries that suffered the humiliation, not of invasion, of defeat. They lost the dignity of their nation. Take France, the great France, to have the Nazi forces march under the symbol of triumph, their Arc de Triomphe, was the biggest humiliation. They will never recover from that. Yet Malta did not fall. So when we think of Malta of late, not Malta of today, where we've lost all our values, we think of religious Malta, Catholic Malta, Malta with its hope in God. We think of what it went through. We think of the role of the church, the role of society, how three enemies, if you like, the British, who were not entirely supported by every sector of society, particularly the ecclesiastics. Then you had the ecclesiastics who controlled the minds of the people. Then you had the people who were also divided on the British government. However, In World War II, there was one enemy. So they all came together. These three factions came together. Like I said, it was a morally just defense, which then became an offense. And Malta was saved the humiliation and the loss of its dignity. So there is an element of national pride. When I look to World War II, it's not just the memorabilia, it's not just the militaria. It was a global event, experienced even in tiny Malta, with a hugely, shall we say, successful outcome at huge cost. And I would say, lest we forget, the effigy of the George Cross reminds every new generation what it represents. The cross in itself talks about life after death and success, good winning over evil. It reflects our Christian values. There's the figure of the emblematic figure of St. George slaying the dragon, the symbol of evil. So all in all, World War II to me is a rather sad but special moment in our country's journey.
Simon, you seem to be really contrasting the present with the past. You mentioned that the Second World War was the last moral war, and it was an ideological struggle. And now you just said that it's sad, but it's also a very important time. Do you think there's an element of nostalgia when you look at the past, especially the way your collection helps you look at the past?
I have to admit, yes. The answer is yes. But why am I nostalgic about that past? I certainly have no wish to relive it. I certainly have, I'm not suggesting to wish to live in that period or that we should return to that type of situation.
Just the clock is going
on. But when I see contemporary Malta today, and I see youth today, and I see the generation, the wartime generation, who I remember very well. Remember, I'm 54 years old. I was born 23 years after the end of World War II, so in my childhood. The protagonists of the war were all around me. They were alive. The people who lived, I heard stories from the horse's mouth. The George Cross Islanders were, mostly alive. Okay? So I am nostalgic at what we lost, not at the war event. I'm nostalgic when there was a time that the Maltese people, despite their diversities, were united. When they all pulled the rope together. Today, I don't even want to think what would happen, how the Maltese would turn on each other, how they would abandon each other in faced with such a situation of war. Whilst 8 years ago, it was a very different story. People were taken in by strangers. There was, I'm not saying it was like this everywhere, but there was a lot of cooperation, a lot of unity, and we've lost those moral bearings. We don't have them anymore. So when I look back and I think of my grandparents' generation, that is the nostalgia, the discipline, the respect, the religious fortitude, how united families were. I still remember how we used to sometimes say prayer before dinner. We used to go to church with the family every Sunday. I remember these things very vividly.
And does your collection allow you to not only connect with the people, but also with the values they held? What we're speaking about right now?
Well, the items, some items don't have, shall we say, any particular link to values. If we look at a wristwatch or a hand grenade or, a piece of munition, I would say those items no. But when I look at a helmet, particularly there, I'm pointing at a helmet with a perforation by shrapnel that most likely killed the person who was wearing it. Then yes, then these personal effects, you know that one day they were worn by people who today are gone, and you wonder, you look in awe, in thought and reflection. You can see side by side with those helmets, there are helmets from the enemy side. So there is this aura, this, what shall we call it, this life attached to some of the artifacts.
It's almost like they're living, no? They're living memories,
So
living things.
when I hold some of these items in my hand, automatically I'm holding them with a lot of reverence and respect for what they represent.
You mentioned that obviously blatantly that these are almost sacred items, right? And we are here, we're literally surrounded by your collection. Obviously, I would assume that this space, your collection, is a sacred space for you personally as well. You come here and you maybe it's a completely separate space from the rest of your world.
Yes, when I step into this room, the first thing you notice is the smell. The smell smells of antiquity. Somehow these items create a combined smell which you do not smell anywhere else in the house. It's a bit of wood, it's a bit of maybe mold, a bit of I don't know. Somehow old items have a particular smell.
And more, you touch as well, maybe they feel a certain way.
So when I step into this room, my mood changes. I feel that it's therapeutic. I feel it's almost spiritual. I feel like I'm totally surrounded by all those friends who have now crossed the bar. They've left this world. And all those memories, those encounters, those beautiful moments, somehow it's like a tonic. If I had a bad day and I walk across the landing in my house and I walk into here, I need to close the door. I need to detach the rest of the house with my experience in here. And sometimes I just sit at my desk, I take my phone, I'm actually doing stuff on my phone which has nothing to do with the collection, but I'm breathing the smell in this room, I'm looking and I get a therapeutic effect. I get calm, it's like I've stepped out of the hustle and bustle of contemporary life, and I'm back with my mates, with my former friends. I feel comfort, I feel an inner peace, and it's an incredible feeling. I don't do this consciously. Just like you look maybe for your favorite armchair or your favorite TV show, even the tick-tocking of this grandfather clock, which you're hearing from 1710, for example, which is signed by the watchmaker, the clockmaker, and still going. It's a connection with a past which I am nostalgic for, like I told you, not because I want to go there, but because I miss in contemporary society the values, the memories, what people were made of in those days. And the artifacts remind me exactly of these things.
And maybe this is the closest space there is to actually time traveling, sort of the closest you can actually get without actually going there.
I think one of the closest is when I drive my military vehicles, because there you bring alive the engine as it would have sounded 80 years ago. You smell the burning diesel, the burning oil. You hear, you feel the heat from the engine, and then you know that this is the non-verbal part. This is something you can't pick up from a book, and you have the exact experience that the driver of that vehicle 80 years before you would have had. So I somehow come closer to it with military vehicles than with holding a helmet, because it's all about the senses.
It is.
And when you're holding a helmet, it's mostly the sense of sight. When you're driving a vehicle, you get a number of other senses. The sense of smell, feel, sight, you get a bit more.
And the object becomes alive. It moves around, sort of.
Exactly.
So it's like...
You open the bonnet, you see the moving parts, and again, I'm very affected by the sense of smell. So, again, when I step in this room, there is an expectation. What someone would think is a smell of stuffiness, of closed, of mold. For me, I sometimes open the book and stick my nose into the book and take a deep breath, and I almost feel like I'm traveling, like I'm connecting.
Smell is very powerful as well, because you can touch something but you feel like your hand is touching it, but with a smell it goes inside you, so it's a total experience.
Yes, so you get with the sense of smell, you also go beyond the sense of sight or feel, so with smell you get the third sense after sight and feel. And I find it extremely soothing, extremely satisfying. It gives me a certain serenity, and sometimes it's the sound of silence is sometimes even better than listening to music. When it's silent and you look around you in here, knowing a lot of the history of the items, there is this incredible sensation of connecting with the hobby that I love so much, with the people that I loved so much, and what they represented.
Maybe towards concluding, of course, every collector has a finite time in this world, and a lot of collectors are very worried. You mentioned that you were working with the National Archives to pass on certain important documents that are of national importance, right? But obviously, only the collector knows the value of his collection best, I think. And obviously, you are the collector in your own, what we can say is much more than just a normal collection. It's much more than just a collection. So what is the best future you can imagine for your collection?
Well, ideally, any one of my 3 children would take an interest in the hobby, and I would not need to let anything out. In an ideal world. Everything would stay where it is, and this would be a sanctuary to be enjoyed by my children, because they may share my hobby and my passion. But forget it, they don't. Okay? They don't, and even though one of them tried, they came from a different generation. They missed the bus. They missed the wartime generation. They don't know them. They can't. I mean, they didn't have the 350 Siege of Malta veteran friends that I had. They don't know them. So I have to be realistic. They cannot appreciate it. So over the course of the remaining time I have in this hobby, I will need to start. I have started. I will need to start to divide the collection between the very special pieces that are priceless, I would say, to the nation. So I have to, at some point, compile a written record and say, these will go to the national collection for obvious reasons. Do I have time to write all the story behind them? Probably not. But I will try to impart enough information to make the national custodian at least conscious that these are related to one particular event or other. And then the rest of the items that could be sold by my heirs, because I can't really contemplate parting with them myself. But then there are certain items that, yes, I would have no difficulty reselling. Should I ever need to, to turn them into the cash that I originally purchased them with? So there are like three.
It would almost be sacrilegious, no? Sort of converting an item that is so...
It depends. Not all of them,
Not all of them, of
are
course.
that precious. Some of them, I even wonder why I bought in the first place today, because I didn't start converging straight away. I used to buy everything. If it's military and it's wartime, I buy it. But today is different. So when I look at a fork and knife with a military marking, they do not impart that spirituality that I get when I handle a malta-camo helmet, for example. So there are certain artifacts that I really will have no difficulty parting with, and occasionally I even wonder why on earth I even bought them. And sometimes I put these up in social media to actually sell them, because space comes at a cost of storing something more precious there, or at a cost of getting damaged because I'm not really interested in bringing them into the house. So they're languishing in a garage. I have a garage next to my museum with almost the same amount of military items there, which I barely look at. So more of those items will get sold in my lifetime, whilst more of these items will not and are more likely to stay here longer than me.
Simon, I hope that your collection has a future ahead. I know it has, because it's such an important collection that I'm sure that it will have its own life. It will find its way, and I'm really hopeful for that. I thank you for your time as well today. I wish we had more time, but maybe we can do another session if you'd like. Before we go, and I forget, I would like you to nominate someone else for us to speak to.
I know a collector, a vehicle collector. He does have a number of military pieces, but he also, I would say he is a motoring collector. Maybe I nominate him because he has saved perhaps the most unlikely of military vehicles, large truck-like or fire engine, commercial military vehicles that are perhaps the least likely to be saved. Maybe a Maltese bus and these type of vehicles. He also has very, very collectible vehicles like sports cars and classic cars. I believe he has about 53 vehicles, so his collection is probably one of the largest in the country. And although I've met very little with the gentleman, we communicate on social media, and when I see things that are of interest and vice versa, we're in touch. And he's a lawyer, and his name is Dr. George Said. And please give him my very best regards when you see him.
Will do. I think it was a very interesting discussion overall. I really enjoyed it. I hope you did as well. As I said, thank you for having us. And it's very interesting to see collectors, where they started from, what motivates them, and how they perceive collecting in all its vicissitudes, and how they do it differently and the same in many different ways. So, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
When my girl and I go out and join the park parade, arm in arm we stroll along, a happy man and maid.